Ecumenical Advocacy Day for Justice at the White House this past weekend. He was flying in supposedly on Tuesday night. Unfortunately, or no, not Tuesday night. Was that right? Yeah, Tuesday. Okay, so he was flying in Tuesday night, and we have had support groups and lawyers waiting for him at the airport, but he didn't come out. We didn't see him process through the paper, so we were just waiting. And eventually, when we didn't hear back from him, and it was already hours since we last heard back, we organized, our friends in California organized an action, and as members of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, different organizations called our allies, church people and Congress folks, and other officials to call the Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, in San Francisco Airport to release him. We were calling, the voicemail was full, and we still did not hear anything from them. There was one pastor who was able to pressure the Philippine consulate to follow up on Jerome because they had not done anything. They basically said that Jerome was fine according to the CBP authorities and that we should just follow their lead. So one of the pastors...
Yes, define the CPB for the listeners, just in case they don't know what this stands for.
So the CBP is the Customs and Border Patrol. So when I say CBP, I'm referring in particular to the one in San Francisco Airport. So, yes, one of the pastors was able to pressure some of the Philippine organizers were able to pressure the consulate to call him. They were finally able to get in touch with him around, I believe it was around 2 or at noon Pacific time on the 18th, and they did get to talk to him, but he seemed like he was under pressure. There were still people in the room. When they found out that he was talking to someone who was not of the consulate, someone from the CBP hung up the call, and we weren't able to continue talking to him. So that was the last time we were able to get in touch with him. We continued mobilizing and calling the office, mobilizing for hours, until we heard that on the morning of the 19th, he was being deported. So I think it was around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Central Time when we heard news that he was to be deported. When we asked CBP why they did that, they said there was a glitch. When we asked them what airline he was in, they gave us the wrong airline. We weren't essentially able to follow up on how he was doing. There was just a lot of questionable things that was happening, and we were not just concerned, we were very confused as to why this was happening. And it wasn't until the day after when Jerome landed and he was able to get when he was initially interviewed by a human rights organization, Karapatan. Karapatan is the human rights organization in the Philippines. And then he had a press conference on the 20th, so it was 9 p.m. Friday night in Chicago.
Was that when he was back in the Philippines? The press conference?
Yes, he was already back in the Philippines. Yeah. And when he was able to be interviewed, and in the press conference, it was exposed that he was being tortured and he was being interrogated.
Yeah, how so? What kind of torture?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to go through. The International Coalition for Human Rights actually released an update as to what happened to him on those 28 hours that he was detained. But I'm going to go through the main points. Basically, first of all, he was denied his right to counsel. Like we said, he has had lawyers waiting for him. They were taking turns, taking shifts, waiting to be able to gain access to him, and he was denied access to a lawyer.
And that often happens, you said, right? That often happens if advocates are detained. That often happens. They're denied a right to a lawyer.
I'm not sure about other cases, but essentially in airports, in the United States, you have the right. You always have the right to a lawyer unless it's an immigration case. And in airports, I don't know the complete legal aspect of it, but from what I understand, you don't always have access to a lawyer. That's why it's imperative for consulates to represent their people of their nationality and help find them a legal counsel. So I don't know in particular for other human rights defenders or for just other immigration situations. Because I remember when the ban happened last year, and we mobilized to the airports, we had to mobilize lawyers as well because we didn't know if folks were allowed access to lawyers. So I don't know if it's because of an airport law or what other legal nuances there are, but the fact is we had lawyers waiting, and we had lawyers for him, and he was not given access to them.
So,
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
So Jerome was, he's an advocate, and then so he comes to the United States to educate policy makers about, does he do the similar work? Is his work similar to the people who are in the Philippines that are educating the Filipinos about what is happening in Mindanao?
Yes, he definitely has been. Let me just answer the previous question a little bit more first. Sorry, it got too long. I promise to keep it short.
That's
Basically, he was told that he is not a U.S. citizen, so he had no access to a lawyer, but he declared his entitlement to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that he is entitled to legal support. And they said that you're not entitled to that, and then he was handcuffed. He was stripped. He was put in front of an industrial fan. He was not allowed access to water. He was barely allowed access to water. He was only allowed to access to food twice, and it was with ham. And if you know Jerome, he is Muslim, so it was a violation of his religion. He was threatened and he was harassed multiple times. He was there was efforts of coercion. There was this one certain agent that kept calling him terrorist, a communist terrorist, a terrorist communist, multiple times.
So that's the CBP agent, Customs and Border Patrol agent.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. It was the Customs and Border Patrol agent. So all of those things were happening to him, and of course he was making efforts to not break down. But it was a very trying experience for him. And there was also firearms that was put in front of him, sort of like, we don't know what the reason behind it was, but they basically left like a grenade and a gun in front of him. So those were things that they did upon him, and so that's why we say that yes, he has been tortured. Yes, he has been treated inhumanely. And to answer your the following question, yes, he has been doing this work in the Philippines as well. So as he is Iranoan Moro, so Iranoan is an indigenous community or indigenous tribe in the Philippines that is Islamicized or Muslim, and he was on the ground when the Mama Sapano massacre happened, when children, women, and journalists were massacred in Mama Sapano. I believe it was in I think January of 2015. He was on the ground documenting when the Kidapawan massacre happened. The Kidapawan massacre happened because farmers were protesting and blocking the highway, calling for the government to give them rice because they were going through a drought and they were not given access to support and resources. And instead of giving them rice, they got bullets from the government, from the military. I believe there were 2 that was killed and many that were mortally wounded, and they found refuge in one of the Methodist church. So he was there on the ground documenting that. He was also on the ground when the bombings of Marawi happened, and as well as other human rights violations that occurred during the current President Duterte's martial law that was declared in Mindanao since 2016. And in documenting these cases, he was part of educating others as well, telling them about what was happening. And besides educating others, he's also a leader. He's a leader of the Swara Bangsa Moro. Bangsa Moro translates to the land of the Moro, or land of the indigenous Muslims. And the Swara Bangsa Moro was an organization that was basically formed after the bombings of Marawi in Mindanao. 400,000 people were displaced, and they became internal refugees, and they were not getting as much support, and so they organized themselves to demand for their right to be able to return to their ancestral land, support for resources, because a lot of them just left and ran from the bombings without anything with them. And so he is the leader of that group. He's also part. Suara Bangsamoro is also part of a national coalition of indigenous peoples organizations called Sandugo, or it translates to One Blood. This is the first time different indigenous communities came together in the Philippines and formed a coalition, and he is, I believe, the vice chair of that coalition. So besides him, a peace advocate, is also an active leader in the community.
So when Jerome and his fellow advocates go out into the Filipino communities in the Philippines and in the U.S., and when they talk with perhaps politicians, do they does he and his fellow advocates describe how the Filipino government, as you described earlier, even though they have laws promoting the indigenous, helping indigenous people, when actually they aren't and are. You described it very well. You could answer that again. Yeah, describe it a little bit better than I am, and then whether or not Jerome and his fellow advocates are educating the public about this situation as well, so that the public knows the root of what is going on there.
Yes, they have been very well informed, and they are making efforts to inform others as well. All the things that I shared with you were things that they actually taught us when they came when they came and spoke a year ago and the year before that. And when we integrate with them, when we do international solidarity missions, medical missions, and fact-finding missions of human rights violations in the Philippines as ICHRP. So they have been making efforts to educate others with this fundamental idea, basically, that the Philippine government is not there for the people. They might talk well, they might have nice pronouncements, but ultimately, if you look at their policies, if you look at what's happening on the ground, they're just pahirap. They're making the Filipino people suffer even more, whether they be indigenous or not.
Mm-hmm. And how is it that they want the multinationals, the companies, to have a say in what the indigenous people's lands? How I really didn't understand how they could put that into effect, to have 100% of what happens to that land be in the hands of foreign corporations. How is that again?
Right. So, yeah, it's very ironic, and it's a lot of legal jargon, I guess. But basically, even though there is a law in 1997 that was passed to protect indigenous people and their land, there's a lot of aspects to it. There's a lot of requirements. One of it is that you have to prove that you and your people have been there since time immemorial, and you have to have documentation of that. First of all, how do you find evidence of being there from time immemorial, right? That can be very subjective. And then there's a law before that was passed in 1995, which is the Mining Act of 1995, that said that public land, which is any land that doesn't really have title, goes to the government, and that the government can allow certain corporations to conduct mining activities in those public land. So if this is an ancestral land and it is not claimed by the indigenous people in that area, because they were not either able to gain title to the land because they didn't have proof, or they didn't even have, or if they didn't have money to go and apply for that, or if they didn't have access to education to know that that was a requirement, apparently, because for the longest time they have just been in that land, and they have just known it as theirs to take care of. So there's a lot of conflict, and as you can see, even though there's a very progressive law, the implementation of it is very questionable.
Right.
And instead, what is being followed through is those laws where they're basically allowing foreign multinational corporations to come in and exploit the land. What I was talking about as far as like 100% ownership of land, I believe hasn't been passed yet, but it is efforts to further strengthen the power that multinational corporations have in the Philippines.
And what was that requirement for education? Is that, do you mean that the government is requiring the ownership of the land to be so the owners have to be educated? Is that what they mean?
Not necessarily. So it wasn't a requirement for the indigenous communities to be educated. But essentially, if you don't know your rights, or if you don't know what the law is, right? If you're not able to read those things, if you're not able to like listen to the news, if no one's there to help educate you about what's happening, they could just easily take it away from you.
Yes, yes, and it's very hard to prove. There's it's just the land is just passed down, and there's likely no documentation. So, what recourse do the indigenous people have internationally? Is there any recourse at the World Court or at the United Nations, anything like that?
So right now, for the longest time, through the Cordillera People's Alliance, La Cordillera People's Alliance is another group of indigenous people from the north. They're Igorot. They have been working with the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Commission, and we have been making efforts to also include Lumad and Moro, which are indigenous people from the south of the Philippines, to include their struggle, to share what's happening. A lot of the demands, or a lot of what they look for is justice. A lot of what they look for is for their voice to be heard. And so I would like to invite everyone to come to the National Speaking Tour that's going to happen with the Chicago leg of the National Speaking Tour. In Northeastern, one of the speakers who's indigenous, Luma teacher, is going to be speaking on the 30th at 4:30 p.m. If you would like to learn more about what's happening, please come, and she can definitely talk more about it. As far as other demands,
that is today. That is today, right? The event.
It's next Monday.
Next month, April 30th. You said, okay.
Correct. Yes, and a lot as far as their other demands. Really, it's to continue doing what we do here, fighting for our rights and raising awareness and connecting our struggle here for education, for healthcare, for housing, to the struggle of people all over the world, especially the struggle of indigenous people, because our struggles are connected.
So are you collaborating with indigenous people in other countries? I'm sure that a lot of this is happening in other countries as well.
Yeah. I've actually, in 2016, when I came back from the Philippines for what was also another international solidarity mission, with this particular group that was evacuated in the Philippines, I came back to the United States, and I went to Standing Rock to stand in solidarity with the Sioux Nation fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline. We have been, so as a Filipino club, we're new, we're very young, but the work that I have been doing with Salupungan through the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, I've been doing this work for 5 years. And we have been working with other indigenous communities as well through the coalition. Although we're not there in person to be there to support them, we have been connecting their demands and their people's struggles with ours when we go and campaign.
Very good. And also, we noticed something on your Facebook page, some pictures, your protests on behalf of the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns for Jerome. Could you talk a little bit about that? I'm
sorry, which one was this? Which picture?
I think you were, the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns was protesting on behalf of Jerome. There were a couple of pictures. Yes, it was just 2 days ago or so.
Oh, the action on Friday.
Yes.
So after what happened to Jerome, we hadn't heard yet that he was tortured. We just knew that he was detained for 28 hours and he was deported. And so after that happened, we united on doing a national action all over the U.S., which is what we call the National Indignation Rally for Jerome, Justice for Jerome. And that's basically what that action was on Friday.
Oh, so there were simultaneous actions in several cities? What kind of, what cities?
So there were actions in Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York. I believe, I'm not sure if there was one in New Jersey. And then there was one here in Chicago. Our allies have been continuing to support us as well. They were sending solidarity statements from Wisconsin and other states all over the U.S.
Mhm. Oh, and in the interest of equal time, if the CBP wants to present to our listeners their side of the story, they are more than welcome to come to WZRD Chicago to present their views. Lorena, you have an event today, right? The Caravan for Peace in the Philippines. Could you describe that?
Sure. So this is actually happening in the East Coast, not in Chicago yet. So the Caravan for Peace, the Stop the Killings National Speaking Tour is starting in Washington, D.C. after the National Ecumenical Advocacy Day. They're going to New York, New Jersey to speak in different forums to educate others about what's happening on the ground. They're coming to Chicago this coming weekend from the 28th to the 30th. They will be speaking in different universities, churches, and spaces as well. And then they're going to Portland, Seattle. They're going to Portland first, and they're basically going to be literally in a bus doing a caravan in the West Coast from going north to south, from Portland, Seattle to the Bay Area down to Los Angeles. That will occur between the May 1st to May 11th.
Oh, wow. Okay, do you have a list where our listeners could access to find the event so that they could attend? Because we have listeners from around the country and around the world, and I'm pretty sure that some of them will catch some of these events if they have a chance to, if they happen to be in close by. So is there anywhere for our listeners to access the list of the events for Caravan for Peace in the Philippines?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to the U.S. chapter of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, I believe the event is there.
Okay.
Yes, it's here.
Okay.
So I can share it with you on your Facebook, maybe.
Yes. As long as you have it on your Facebook page, and then our listeners could access your Facebook page, and then that'll be good. Because it sounds like a very extensive list, and it's very hard for our listeners to catch all of it right now.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, another question is, we've been talking about DACA Dreamers a lot. So are there any DACA Dreamers from the Philippines in Chicago, or let's say in the U.S. as well? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's the population of, last I heard, the population of Filipinos in the United States is at 4 million, and 1 million of our people are undocumented. A lot of them are not able to access DACA because of the requirements that DACA has. As we know, DACA is very limited. It's only for a certain group of people who are at a certain age, who have arrived at a certain time, who have arrived at certain circumstances. So in Chicago, there's still quite a number of folks who applied for DACA. But the reality is a lot of folks have not been able to apply for it. It might be fear that if they apply, their parents, who might also be undocumented, might be targeted as well, because now their records will be on. There's a lot of factors affecting it. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of Filipino youth who are also
Is that fear substantiated then? What might that really play out if they were to apply? Would their I know that they're afraid that their parents might be targeted, but is it a valid fear?
I think instead of it being a valid fear, I think it's more of a challenge. This reality that we have in our community. I think the need here, beyond just applying for DACA, is the need to organize and to uplift our community so that fear isn't going to be, so that people don't get paralyzed by that fear, and instead we continue to fight for our rights. I don't know if I was able to share this as well. Besides folks who were DACA eligible, a lot of Filipinos have actually come to the United States as trafficked workers. Mm-hmm. A lot of them were, for folks who don't know what trafficking is, labor trafficking is, It's basically when you are coerced or there is fraud involved or you were threatened. When you came here, you might have been, for example, if you signed this contract that says you're supposed to earn a certain amount of money, you're supposed to be working this many hours, these are your working conditions, and you come here and you find that your job doesn't exist, which is what happened to 300 people in Washington, D.C., who were teachers and came here and found out they didn't have teaching jobs, which is what happened to the bakers in Los Angeles. 11 of them were told that they would come in to work as at this bakery, and instead they became domestic workers and worked like slaves and very in conditions that did not meet their contract. There's a lot of cases like that happening, and a lot of them end up becoming undocumented workers here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's more of the issue in our Filipino community. There's also a lot of folks end up becoming caregivers and domestic workers because they found themselves undocumented in this country, because they don't have access to other means of work, and become exploited, their labor becoming exploited. And so, yeah, I think but I don't know if the question, if the fear is founded or not, is a priority. I think the bigger question is, what can we do to serve our community, and what can we do to uplift and continue to fight for our community?
So are there any organizations that are helping to educate these workers and these undocumented people so that they could have options open to them about what their next step could be instead of remaining in their conditions now?
Yeah, so the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns has been organizing and supporting undocumented immigrants all over the U.S. There's also organizations or community organizations in New York, New Jersey, or in D.C., through Gabriela, in L.A., or Southern California through the Filipino Migrant Center, in the Bay Area or North California through the Filipino Community Center, and different peoples and immigrant organizations called Migrante, with different chapters all over the U.S. We're trying to build one in Chicago to support our kababayans, fellow Filipinos who are struggling through that. There's also the Fellowship for Filipino Migrants has been organizing and supporting undocumented Filipinos' rights since the early 2000s here. And yeah, there's a lot of different support groups that can come, but ultimately the need is for us to organize as a community to stand for each other.
Yes, absolutely. So if our listeners, and especially our students, because we have so many civic-minded students at Northeastern Illinois University, if they know about this, they might want to help. Do you have a list of the organizations that you just described to me, or otherwise you could just provide them later on your Facebook page and then we could share?
For sure. I will definitely try to do it right now. I have to rush to class soon. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, Lorena. So thank you so much. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM, and we have been speaking with Lorena, the president of the Filipino Club at NEIU. And thank you so much, Lorena, for sharing so much information about the plight of the indigenous people and our undocumented Filipinos in the U.S. with us at the station today.